Today I want to talk about rhetoric, but first, to the person who left a comment, thankful that my move to YouTube would make it so that my followers no longer have to listen to me rant about crazy comments that people leave on my videos. Yeah, about that. I apologize for this video in advance, because like I said, I want to talk about rhetoric, which can be a very broad topic. For example, if we take this definition from the Wikipedia page of rhetorical devices, it leaves many questions unanswered, such as what does it mean to persuade someone with your message? And that question someday may very well have its own series dedicated to it. For now, I just want to test the waters with something I've been thinking about, especially as I've been making other videos, in which I'm beginning to see a bigger picture with questions that I keep finding pop up again and again. And in answering all these, I'm led back to a conclusion I made in a previous video. No. False equivalence is still not a thing. In that previous video, I explained why it has no authority, no logical foundation, and doesn't speak to the validity of an argument itself, so go watch that because I'm not going to rehash any of that here. I will, however, add some context to this video in terms of what came after, which was some people were not very happy. Now, obviously, the comments were long-winded, to say the very least, so to briefly state what seems to be the main point of contention, was it fair to say that false equivalence is not a thing? Well, the easiest way to answer that question, I think, is to work through what kind of thing it could be until there's nothing left. First of all, is it a logical thing, as it claims to be? A fallacy, as the internet says it is? No, I disproved that in the previous video, and as you can see from comments like these, this doesn't seem to be a point of contention. Instead, we get the claim that it is an important part of speech or rhetoric, which I find hard to believe, because this person's argument basically just becomes, it is something people say. And here, in the idea that I should accept a linguistic standard as opposed to a logical one, to accept the importance of this concept, this person has all but conceded that it is illogical. So it is an illogical thing that people say to persuade others? Yeah, that's my point. I don't really find that convincing, so I doubt it is an important part of rhetoric. But looking past this blatant attempt to attack the value of my argument instead of addressing the content of it, because I never said that people are logical, let's address false equivalence's rhetorical value, because, spoiler alert, it doesn't have any. Obviously, I've made my, as these people say, bias towards this claim as clear as day. I think this buzzword has created a culture of people simply ignoring comparative arguments and shouting false equivalence when they hear an argument that they don't like. I could say that that makes it a bad rhetorical device, and I have said that in the past. But if I'm being honest, and we're examining this thoroughly, obviously my claim here hinges on two things. One, that dishonesty is bad rhetoric, though obviously if we're willing to throw logic out the window, why not just throw out all nature of purposeful discussion and just trick people? Two, and perhaps this is a bigger flaw in my argument here, this sort of blames the actions of the many on the few. Obviously, I don't personally see this as a flaw. Because given that we've already gotten rid of logic, it's not as though we can really say, you can't tell me that I can't use it properly because other people use it improperly. If it isn't based on the standards of logic, then it's based on the standards of language. In which case, yes, that's actually what I can and will do. Because by a linguistic standard, common use is proper use. Granted, that could leave open the door for the idea of multiple conflicting meanings if we're speaking devoid of logic. So you know what? Sure, let's say that it's not enough to say that it is often used wrong, even though it damn well should be. So instead, let's ask ourselves how the concept of false equivalence could be important in rhetoric. I think imaginably one would say that it is important to call out false equivalences as a rhetorical device, which I think fairly implies that, other people want to use it, meaning it has rhetorical power to mislead. Here then it is important to understand how to call out false equivalence and why. Although again, here in an argument devoid of logic, I could never for the life of me tell you why it's important. I guess because we want to convince people one thing and not have them convinced otherwise, but why that is? Because it makes us feel good and we're only allowed to feel good, not our opposition. But yeah, there it really seems to be an all roads lead to Rome sort of situation. We don't want people to be convinced by false equivalences, and thus if false equivalences are not convincing, then there is no need to guard against them. And so in that, it's fairly easy to prove that false equivalence is not an important part of rhetoric, as false equivalences are not convincing. Obviously, in the previous video, I said that false equivalences always take the form of other actual fallacies. So here it stands to reason that I would argue that defending against false equivalence is defending against each actual fallacy behind it. But I don't just mean that. Consider some well-known fallacies: ad hominem, appeal to ridicule, false dichotomy, to name a few. Also now, for the sake of argument, consider that a person committing one of these fallacies is aware that his argument contains it, but is included as a dishonest means to persuade the listener. In that, couldn't each be given a purpose? For example, ad hominem is meant to appeal to either ethos or pathos. Appeal to ridicule distracts from the argument in much the same way, convincing people superficially. And likewise, false dichotomy is a distraction meant to convince people that there are only two choices, making it more likely that the listener will concede to the speaker's point. So with that all being said, what is the purpose of false equivalence? I'll give you a moment to think about that, because the answer, of course, is there is none. Generally here, when we ask ourselves what the purposes of these fallacies are, we are essentially asking how they aim to twist logic in the arguer's favor. In short, how they are wrong. Asking how a false equivalence leads to an argument going wrong results in a fairly unimaginative answer of, well, you said two things were the same when they weren't. And that's not some elaborate thing that has the purpose to pull the wool over someone's eyes. We aren't falsely eliminating other possible choices to make our conclusion seem more convincing. We aren't attacking someone's character to distract from the argument. We are literally just stating two things are the same when we know they're not. And that's just our conclusion. We are just stating our conclusion as the argument. That isn't going to trick anybody. When you see examples of what political pundits label as false equivalence, usually it has to do with comparing the actions of one person with the actions of another on the opposite side of the political spectrum. Not only is the convincing power there not just saying they're the same when they're not, and is instead going to be some other strategy like whataboutism, ad hominem, or guilt by association, but also the reason most people are willing to follow those false statements of equivalence is because of tribalism. So it's funny how these people are lecturing me on the importance of this term and how we need to be aware of it when they are aware of nothing. They are not actually addressing the problems behind these false equivalences. They are slapping a buzzword on it that holds little more meaning than going around and saying, oh, that's the false statement fallacy. You mean it's just a false statement? Just like a false equivalence is simply saying two things are equal when they're not? It's not some special thing in and of itself. And if after both these videos you still don't believe me, consider this. Saying something is a false equivalence is itself a fallacy. This is not true by use, but by definition. If false equivalence is saying two things are equal when they are not, and it is a fallacy, then putting both together, here we have it that you are claiming a fallacy in an argument implies a false conclusion, which violates the principle that truth and validity are not one and the same, making an example of an argument from fallacy, or the fallacy. Here you are saying a conclusion is wrong because the argument that yields it contains a fallacy, which must necessarily be true since the conclusion in a false equivalence is these things are the same when they are not. So either fallacy is not a fallacy, or false equivalence is not a fallacy. But seeing as fallacy is given its legitimacy through concepts like denying the antecedent, and false equivalence is something the internet made up, I'm gonna go with false equivalence is not a fallacy, nor is it a rhetorical device. It doesn't speak to the validity of an argument. It is a statement of truth claiming that two things claimed to be equal are not. And so that's basically what I meant when I, said just that in the previous video. I didn't think I'd have to elaborate on that with a whole other video, but I guess I forgot that this is the same internet that made up this concept in the first place, so what should I expect?